Okay, so today we're going to talk about pure monopoly, which is chapter 8 in your book. Okay, this is the first lecture of week 5, first and only one, because pure monopoly actually goes fairly quickly. Okay, it's not overly complicated, and we don't have to worry about the long run the way we did with perfect competition. Okay, in monopoly, the long run. I shouldn't say it's unimportant. What goes on in the short run in monopoly is sufficient to talk about the long run. Okay, whatever goes on in the short run is more or less the same thing that goes on in the long run because of one of the assumptions for monopoly. Okay, and just to round out that point, blocked entry is the reason why the short run and the long run are the same thing in monopoly, okay? Only because, if you recall from week 4, right, in perfect competition, in the short run, right, you can be making profit if the individual firm is receiving a price above the break-even point, okay? However, in the long run, right, in perfect competition, because of competition, where people go from one industry to another, and vice versa, eventually there will be no profit in the long run, okay? Well, that is made possible, simply by the fact that there is free entry and exit in perfect competition, okay? Because people can stop being a corn farmer and instead start producing water bottles, then you can have people moving around, which would have individual producers switch industries, which means the short run will be different from the long run. In monopoly, there is no free entry and exit. There's blocked entry, okay? Since entry is blocked, the short run is the long run, right? So there's one producer in an industry, and he or she is always going to be the producer because no one else can get into that industry. That's a monopoly, right? Mono means one, right? Monopoly, okay? So just to start, right, let's talk about the assumptions of pure monopoly. Monopoly is the exact opposite of perfect competition. If you turn back in your notes or rewatch the lecture, okay, you'll notice that these assumptions are completely different. They're the exact opposite of the assumptions for perfect competition, okay? In perfect competition, we had free entry and exit, close substitute products, okay, or standardized products, price makers, and many sellers, right? And there was a ton of sellers, hundreds of thousands of sellers. Well, here in pure monopoly, you have only a single seller. That's mono, right? Monopoly, monopoly. That's a single seller, one seller. Okay? There's no close substitutes. No substitutes whatsoever. So let's start thinking about what our example for monopoly is going to be. A very easy one would be diamonds. Okay? The diamond trade. I think I've mentioned this before. If I didn't, I'm sorry, it's only relevant until now. Diamonds, De Beers controls the vast majority of diamond mining in the diamond trade. Okay? So if you think about it, De Beers, they're a single seller. There's no close substitutes, right? You can't give a girl something other than a diamond, right? Which just to talk about the marriage thing. But a diamond is a diamond, right? A ruby doesn't really count the same way a diamond counts, right? If you want to talk about the things that are used, the way diamonds are used to cut really, really tough objects, right? Diamond is the sharpest thing, the toughest thing in the world. Well, you can't exactly just use an emerald instead of a diamond, right? If you need a diamond saw, you can't use an emerald saw. You need a diamond saw, okay? So there's no close substitutes. There's blocked entry. We'll talk about that in a second. Blocked entry just means that I can't just go decide to be a diamond miner, okay? Finally, all these three things, right? You're the only one in the industry, there's no substitutes, and no one can enter into your industry. You're the only one, and everyone needs your product, and no one can come in and challenge you, right? Well, that leads to the realization that they are price makers, okay? Right? If you're the only one, no one can come into your industry, and you have something everyone needs, such as a diamond instead of a ruby or an emerald, well, that means I can decide what price I want to charge. So now I am a price maker, okay? Now I should just give you a little bit of background on why the neoclassicals came up with a monopoly theory in the first place, okay? I mentioned in my first lecture that the neoclassicals were writing to more or less refute Karl Marx, right? Karl Marx, what did he say? We're going to talk about this next week. But for the most part, Marx simply said, in capitalism, corporations will get bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually what they will do is they're going to end up impoverishing workers, okay? Therefore, Marx said capitalism stinks, right, for shorthand. But he basically said capitalism is an unworkable economic system which eventually, well, it contains the seeds of its own demise, okay? Eventually, so many people are going to be fed up with being poor and unemployed that there will be a communist revolution, okay? That's what Marx believed. Now, the neoclassicals didn't like the way that sounded, so the neoclassicals were out to prove capitalism does not stink. Capitalism is socially harmonious. And all this we talked about in week 1. Okay? So, as time goes on, right, Marx publishes in 1867, the neoclassicals publish in 1871 to 1873. In the next 30 to 50 years, you had the neoclassicals with perfect competition, and you had Karl Marx with saying corporations are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Okay, who remembers their economic history of America from 1880 to 1920? What happened then? If you remember, those are the big names in American business history, right? J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, okay, things like that, right? These were the really rich guys, and they all had monopolies, okay? J.P. Morgan controlled the rails and banking. Carnegie controlled steel. Vanderbilt, he was in finance too, I believe. But they all controlled a lot of things. Rockefeller controlled oil. And if you want to know just how big Standard Oil was, if I'm not mistaken, when Standard Oil, which was Rockefeller's company, when it was finally broken apart, if I'm not mistaken, Standard Oil of New Jersey became Shell, and Standard Oil of New York became Exxon. So just think about that. Rockefeller owned Shell and Exxon, and I'm pretty sure that another one he owned turned into Chevron. Okay? So basically the guy controlled all of the gas stations that we all go to. Okay? That's a monopoly. So, why did neoclassicals need to come up with a theory of monopoly? To remain relevant, right? Marx said, look, these corporations are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually they're going to impoverish everyone. Neoclassicals, in perfect competition, said, no, remember, firms can't get very large, right? Why? Because they'll hit their long-run average total cost curves, where it starts to slope up, right, because of diseconomies of scale. The neoclassicals say that the long-run average total cost curve starts to slope upwards because of diseconomies of scale. Basically, once a company gets so big, it's really hard to manage it. Okay? So if you are just the average human looking around in 1890, 1900, 1910, you say, okay, this Marx guy said corporations are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and that implies capitalism is going to be bad for all of us. On the other hand, the neoclassicals say capitalism is really great and don't worry, companies can't get all that big. Okay, if you look around, I have Vanderbilt, Morgan, Rockefeller, Carnegie. It seems like these companies are really big and perfect competition is questionable. Well, if people start saying, you know, Marx was sort of right about those companies getting bigger and bigger and bigger, the next step is for people to think, if he was right about companies getting bigger and bigger and bigger, does that mean we're all about to become really poor and unemployed? Okay? So, if you are an economist of a neoclassical persuasion in the 1890s, 1900s, 1910, you don't like Marx, you don't want him to be correct, but people are starting to think maybe this Marx guy had a point. So what do? You need to come up with a theory of monopoly. Okay? You need to create a theory of monopoly in order to remain relevant, right? Because it's fairly obvious, perfect competition, that's simply not true. Okay? In terms of, well, perfect competition says all these companies are going to stay really small, and it looks like they're getting really, really big. One guy said they were going to get really big. One guy said, don't worry. One group of guys said, don't worry about it. That one seems to be correct, right? So in order to stay relevant, neoclassicals didn't have to abandon perfect competition, but they had to come up with another market model, right, in order to describe why firms were getting so big. That was monopoly, okay? So that's why this theory even exists. And like I said, the assumptions they made were that there's a single seller, no close substitutes, blocked entry, and the firm is a price maker, okay? So what does blocked entry mean? Basically, blocked entry means there are barriers to entry, okay? Why are there barriers to entry? There's 3 different reasons I believe your book talks about. Yeah, 3 different reasons why there might be barriers to entry in a neoclassical world. Okay, the first one is simply economies of scale, meaning that you're really, really efficient at what you make, okay? Such as Microsoft, right? It may take Microsoft $1 million to make the first CD of whatever the next Microsoft Office program is, right? The next Microsoft operating system. But the second CD will cost 2 cents. The third CD will cost 2 cents. The fourth CD will cost 2 cents. So the more and more you produce, the more your average costs are going down. Okay? Because eventually that $1 million will get split up into 3 billion CDs. Okay? That would be an economy of scale. It just simply means the more you produce, the cheaper it gets. So that's one reason you may have a monopoly. Okay? The second one concerns legal barriers to entry. Okay? Legal barriers to entry could mean a whole lot of things. In capitalism, property rights are very, very important. Okay? What does that mean? If you come up with a patent, if you have an idea, that means you control the rights to it. Okay? So if you came up with, well, this is an Android, but you guys all know how on smartphones you can go like that and zoom in, right? Well, Apple decided to patent that. That's why Apple and Google are currently fighting in court for probably the next 10 years. Okay? Pharmaceutical drugs, right? Tylenol, ibuprofen's generic, but Tylenol, Advil, Excedrin. These are all patented drugs, right? What's the name of that company? Pfizer, right? Pfizer is one drug company. Pfizer is not legally allowed to make Tylenol because Tylenol is owned by Johnson & Johnson, okay? So therefore, Johnson & Johnson has a legal barrier to entry, right? no one can just start producing Tylenol. Why? Because they have a patent over it. Okay? So that's one way, and most of the time people think legal barriers to entry involve the government, and sometimes they do. But most of the time, barriers to entry are actually created by private companies. Okay? Because private companies do not like competition at all. As much as the neoclassicals may say, capitalism is all about competition and we want to maximize competition, companies actually work to eliminate competition. Okay? Because just imagine, if you are a company, do you want people competing against you? Of course not. Right? You want to have no competitors so you can make all the money you possibly can. Okay? So a legal barrier to entry, the first one could be a patent. Another example could be when the government does award a monopoly to a company. Okay? Take your gas, right? If you live in Jersey City, or no, I think it's even all throughout New Jersey. Take your gas and your water and your electricity. Who provides you with that? It's PSE&G, right? PSE&G is not a government company, okay? What it is it's a private company that the state of New Jersey has said, okay, you have a monopoly on all of the utilities in Jersey City or Hudson County, right? And what you get in exchange for those rights, okay, so when the mayor of Jersey City says the only water and electricity supplier in Jersey City will be PSE&G, okay, so you're guaranteed to have customers. One of the stipulations that usually comes with that is that you can only raise your prices 3% every year, okay? So you will have a monopoly, but you can't just start charging people $1,000 per gallon of water, okay? Another reason for a pure monopoly would be ownership or control of resources, okay? Such as if you control all of the diamond mines in South Africa. That's what De Beers does, right? De Beers owns diamond mines all over the world, okay? If you owned the diamond mine, you inherently have a monopoly, right? Because no one else can just come in and take your diamonds. Okay? So if you own the essential resource of production, such as diamonds, okay, then what you end up with is another case where you could have a monopoly. Okay? For those who have seen, you know, the James Bond movies, what's the name of it? The one that came after Casino Royale. Quantum of Solace, I believe. Yeah, that's it, Quantum of Solace. Where what they were talking about was privatizing the water supply. Okay, basically what they wanted to do was buy up the bad guys in the movie. They want to buy up the water supply of South America, right? So that way they have a monopoly on water, okay? And believe it or not, as evil as that sounds, a lot of companies right now are trying to do that exact thing, okay? Maybe the movie gave them an idea or not. But that would be another example of monopoly, okay? Or another reason why a monopoly would be created, and there would be blocked entry, okay? So you can own the essential resource, such as water, diamonds, things like that. You can have legal barriers to entry, such as patents, or the government could award you a monopoly. Or thirdly, you could have it derived from economies of scale, right? You're just so much better producing something than the next guy that you end up with a monopoly, okay? So, now we need to talk about the demand curve within monopoly. principles of monopoly. What are the principles of monopoly? Okay? This is a very, very important thing to understand. In a monopoly, the market demand, okay, the demand curve that you know of, the market demand curve, not the individual producer demand curve, the market demand curve, the one we discussed in week 2. In monopoly, the market demand curve is the demand curve facing the firm. Okay? Now let me juxtapose this against perfect competition. If you remember, in perfect competition, there were 2 demand curves. The demand curve for the market, this one, and the demand curve facing the individual. The demand curve facing the individual was perfectly elastic. Okay? If you remember that. That is why, and this is only true for perfect competition, but in perfect competition, price was equal to marginal revenue. Okay? In perfect competition, price is equal to marginal revenue. In monopoly, marginal revenue is less than price. Okay? In monopoly, marginal revenue is less than price. In pure competition, marginal revenue is equal to price. Okay? That's going to be a big difference here. Okay? But if you remember, in perfect competition, you had the market demand curve, which was the demand curve for the whole market, and you had a perfectly elastic demand curve facing the individual firm. In monopoly, the market demand curve is the demand curve facing the individual producer. Okay? In other words, in monopoly, the demand curve of the market is the demand curve for that producer. Why is the market demand curve the curve for the individual producer? Because he or she is the only producer. Right? Here, you had a market demand curve and you had thousands, hundreds of thousands of producers, which is why there are different demand curves. Okay? You have one for the individual producer, and you have one for the market, right? And that's why the individual producer is a price taker. Okay? It's a price taker, meaning he has a perfectly elastic demand curve facing the individual firm, because he or she cannot raise their price 1 cent because there's so many people producing everything, producing the same thing, that if he or she decided to raise their price 1 cent, everyone would just go to someone else, right? There's hundreds of thousands of producers, and everything produced is standardized, right? It's simply water bottles, right? Or water. Water is water. Corn is corn. Okay? In a monopoly, there's only one producer, right? Everyone who wants a diamond has to go to De Beers. Everyone who wants Tylenol must go to Johnson & Johnson. Everyone who wants Microsoft must go to Microsoft. So therefore, the market demand curve, the demand curve for diamonds, which would be the market demand curve, is the demand curve that De Beers faces. Right? De Beers doesn't have to deal with this. De Beers, however many people want diamonds, which is the diamond market, well, that's the demand curve De Beers faces. Okay? So, the market demand is the demand curve for the firm. Okay? If you are a... Why is that? Because you are the entire market, right? If you have something that everyone else wants to buy, and you are the only person who makes it, therefore, their demand, right? If you add up all their demands, which becomes the market demand curve, well, they're all coming to you. Okay, so therefore, you're facing the market demand curve. Okay? Since in monopoly, the demand curve facing the individual firm is the market demand curve, right? That's what I just went over. It's in monopoly, since you're the only producer, if you have something everyone wants and they can't go anywhere else for it, their demands becomes the demand you face. So you're facing the market demand curve, okay? Meaning the demand curve a producer faces in monopoly is not perfectly elastic. Okay? It's not horizontal. It's simply the downward sloping market demand curve that you learned in chapter 2. Okay? Or sorry, not chapter 2, week 2. It's chapter 3. Okay? Because the market demand curve is the demand curve the individual producer faces in monopoly, marginal revenue is less than price. Okay, and we're going to go over that because that's also important. In perfect competition, I mentioned that price is equal to marginal revenue. Okay, that's not true in monopoly. In monopoly, price is greater than marginal revenue. Okay, or another way of saying that is marginal revenue is less than price in monopoly, whereas in perfect competition, marginal revenue is equal to price. Okay? This is another very important principle of monopoly. Okay? So why is marginal revenue less than price? I drew this simple diagram up here for you. Let's say you sell 1 unit of output. We can make this diamonds. We'll call it diamonds. Let's say that you sell, and the prices are a little off. Take my word for it. I just got engaged. Let's say you sell 1 diamond for $5. Okay? Well, that means your marginal revenue is $5. Okay? So you take in $5, right? And the price was $5. Okay? For the first unit of output in monopoly, price is equal to marginal revenue. Everything after that, price will be greater than marginal revenue. Or said another way, marginal revenue is less than price. Okay? For the second unit, okay, so let's write that up here. For the first unit you sell, you get a price of $5, which means your marginal revenue is $5. Now let's say you decide to sell 2 diamonds, okay, 2 units of output. So you sell 2 diamonds. In order to sell 2, you have to lower your price to $4 per diamond. Okay? $4 per diamond. So I sold 1 diamond for $5. Now I decide to sell 2 for $4 each. Okay? So the price was $4. my marginal revenue is only $3. Why is that? Okay? 4 times 2 is 8. Okay? 4 times 2 is 8. So my total revenue was $8. So I brought in $4 from the first diamond, $4 from the second diamond. So that's 8 altogether. If I sold 1 diamond, my marginal revenue was $5. If I sold I take that back, sorry. If I sold 1 diamond, my total revenue was $5 as well, right? I sell 1 diamond and I get $5 in return for it. Now, if I sell 2 diamonds, 1, 2, I'm getting $8. Okay? So, what that's saying is that my marginal revenue, the extra amount of revenue that I made by selling the second diamond, was actually $3, right? If I sold 1, I received $5 total. If I sold 2 diamonds, I received $8 total. Okay? So what's the difference between selling the first diamond and the second diamond? $3, right? I would have made $5 the first time, and I made $8 the second time. 8 minus 5 is 3. Okay? So, what that means is, after the first unit in pure monopoly, price is always greater than marginal revenue. And I'll just do another one to show you it continues. Let's say I decide that I don't want to just sell 2 diamonds, I want to sell 3 diamonds. Okay? So, what I do is I sell 3 diamonds at a price of $3 each, right? I have to sell it at a lower price because the demand curve slopes downwards. I'm facing the market demand curve. We all know as in order to get quantity demanded to go up, price has to go down. It's the law of demand. Price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. So if I want to sell more diamonds, I have to lower the price. I have to lower it from 5 to 4 to 3. Okay? So, if I was selling 2 diamonds at $4 each, that would be $8 total. Okay, my total revenue would be $8 if I sold 2 diamonds. Well, now I decided to sell 3 diamonds at a price of $3 each. So that means I sold 3 diamonds at $3 each. I'm pulling in $9 total. I sold 3 diamonds at $3 each. Okay? $9 total. When I sold 2 diamonds for $4 each, I made $8. Okay? So, what was the benefit? What was the marginal revenue for selling the 3rd diamond? It would be 9, right? 3 times 3, 9 minus 8, which is 4 times 2. Okay? So it's 9 minus 8. The marginal revenue of selling the 3rd diamond is $1. So you can see a pattern forming here. After the first unit, okay, after you sell 1 diamond, for every single unit after the first unit, so it means 2 to infinity, price is always greater than marginal revenue. Okay? Or another way of saying it is that marginal revenue is less than price. Okay? In monopoly, and this is a really important principle of monopoly, for every unit after the first unit, marginal revenue is less than price. Okay? Which you can clearly see here. Marginal revenue is 3, price is 4. Marginal revenue is 1, price is 3. Marginal revenue is less than price. What that means, or why is that important, is on page 184 down at the bottom, where you can see now, I'm just going to clean this up a little. Since marginal revenue is less than price, that means that the marginal revenue curve, which is on page 184 down at the bottom, it's in black, okay, on the graph at the bottom of the page. Marginal revenue is the black curve, and it means that marginal revenue sits below the demand curve, okay? The marginal revenue curve lies below the demand curve. Why? Because price is greater than marginal revenue, or vice versa, marginal revenue is less than price. Okay? Since marginal revenue is less than price, the marginal revenue curve lies below the demand curve. Okay? Now that we know the principles of monopoly, such as marginal revenue is less than price, the only real thing we need to do now is figure out how does the monopolist determine how much he or she wants to produce, right? How do they determine how much output they're going to make? How many diamonds will they produce? Okay? The answer to that is on page 186 on the graph. If you'll recall, from last week's discussion, from week 4, right, in our perfect competition discussion, the way you maximize total revenue is by producing up till the point at which marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Okay? The example I gave you is, let's say you produce a slice of pizza, whatever, right? You make your first slice of pizza and you sell it for $1. Okay? And your marginal cost, if you sell it for $1, your marginal revenue will be $1. And then, let's say your marginal cost for the first slice was 10 cents. Okay? So that means you made 90 total cents profit. Okay, good. Then, let's say your you sell a second slice of pizza for $1 again. And your marginal cost was 80 cents. Okay? That means you made 20 additional cents. Okay? Then you produce a third slice of pizza, sell it for $1, and this time your marginal cost is up to 95 cents. Okay, you made 5 cents. Now let's say you produce a fourth slice of pizza, sell it for $1, and the marginal cost was 99 cents. You still made a cent. What you should do in order to maximize your total revenue is you produce until marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Now I hope I don't confuse you, so I'm going to try to write this very clearly. You always can maximize total revenue by having marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. Okay? So, now you can always maximize total revenue by having marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. There's a difference between perfect competition and monopoly, though. And that's what I'm going to write up here. So remember, you will always maximize total revenue by having marginal revenue equal marginal cost, okay? But in perfect competition, price is equal to marginal revenue, which is equal to marginal cost, okay? That's what PC stands for. In perfect competition, price is equal to marginal revenue, which is equal to marginal cost, okay? Why is that? Why is price equal to marginal revenue? It's because the individual producer faces a perfectly elastic demand curve. On the other hand, in monopoly, we just saw marginal revenue is less than price. Okay? In monopoly, marginal revenue is less than price. So, in pure monopoly, that's what PM stands for, pure monopoly. In pure monopoly, price is greater than marginal revenue, which is equal to marginal cost. Okay? In both instances, marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. That's how you will always maximize your total revenue. Okay? You always want to produce until marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. The difference is that in perfect competition, price is equal to marginal revenue, whereas in pure monopoly, price is greater than marginal revenue. Okay? So, let's say you're a business owner, you want to know how to maximize total revenue. The answer is set your marginal revenue equal to your marginal cost. Okay? That's how you'll always maximize total revenue, is by setting marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. Okay? So you're a business owner, you sit down one day, you say, okay, how much output should I produce? Well, you should produce output until your marginal revenue is equal to your marginal cost. That's what you should always do, no matter whether it's perfect competition or pure monopoly. Okay? You should always produce output until marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. The difference between these two, you always want to produce output to where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. But in perfect competition, price will also be equal to marginal revenue, which will be equal to marginal cost. Whereas in monopoly, price will be greater than marginal revenue, which is equal to marginal cost. Okay? So having said that, that's a big difference between pure competition and monopoly. Having said that, let's see how the monopolist determines his level of output. Okay? His or her level of output. What a monopolist will do is set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. Okay? The difference is that a monopolist will have a price that's higher than his or her marginal revenue. In order to see how much output the monopolist produces, we're going off page 186 here, let's draw our cost curves again. And I'm going to leave out the average variable cost because it doesn't really factor into this. It's our marginal cost curve. Average total cost curve. This will be our demand curve. Okay? And now we're going to draw in the marginal revenue curve. Okay. At point A, okay, at point, what I've labeled as point A, marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Our marginal cost curve is equal to marginal revenue at point A. Okay? So remember, in pure monopoly, you still want marginal revenue to be equal to marginal cost. You say to yourself, how much output should I produce? Well, I'm going to produce output to where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Fair enough? But that's how much output the monopolist will produce. Okay. What price should he or she charge now, though? What you do is you have marginal cost equal to marginal revenue. That will be your should come to this side of the camera. That will be your equilibrium level of output. Okay? Now that you have marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, you know exactly how much you should produce. Okay? Now, if this was perfect competition, marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Okay, what price should I charge? Well, it'll just be whatever my marginal revenue is. Okay? Now, in monopoly, since marginal revenue is less than price, you have to figure out what price you should charge. So, you determine your output first, you go your level of output, which is determined by marginal cost being equal to marginal revenue, which I've labeled as point A. Does your book label it as anything? Your book just has a little arrow going to it that says marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Okay? But that's right here, point A. That's what I've labeled as point A. So that's how much output you should produce. What price should you produce? At. What price should you produce at? Then you continue this vertical line up from quantity. You continue it up until you run into the market demand curve. Okay? So I found where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. And I labeled that as point A. Then I drew a line down to my equilibrium quantity. That's the quantity I should produce at. But what price should I charge for that quantity? In order to do that, you go upwards. From point A, you go up until you run into the market demand curve. Okay? When you run into the market demand curve, going vertically, that will be the starting point for figuring out your price. Once you have this quantity, all you have to do is draw a horizontal line you only have to draw a horizontal line over to the vertical axis to find your equilibrium price. Okay? And that is how you find how a monopolist finds what price they should charge and how much they should produce at that price. Okay? What you do, just to go over it one more time, you find where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, which I labeled as point A. Then you draw a line from point A down to the horizontal axis. Okay? Draw a line down to the x-axis. That's your equilibrium quantity. So now you know how many diamonds, water, Microsoft CDs you should be producing. Okay? But what should you charge? What should your price be for each one of those diamonds or CDs? Okay? Well then, you just you continue drawing the vertical line upwards till you intersect the market demand curve. When you intersect the market demand curve, you draw another line over to the y-axis, to the vertical axis, and that will be your equilibrium price. So now you know how much to produce, and you know the price that it should be produced at. Okay? Finally, the monopolist has a characteristic, or because of this, right? Because there are barriers to entry, the monopolist gets something that perfect competition does not. Okay? In other words, because of those assumptions, single seller, barriers to entry, no close substitutes. Because of those three things, which are essentially saying you're the only producer of a good that no one else can make, and no one else can start coming into your market and making it, right? Single seller, no close substitutes, barriers to entry. Because of that, the monopolist gets profit. Okay? It's a big difference between monopoly and perfect competition. A monopolist makes profit in the long run. In the long run, a monopolist makes profit. Well, they make profit in the short and the long run. Okay? Because this is what the long and the short run looks like, because there are barriers to entry. So in the long and the short run, the monopolist makes profit. Whereas in perfect competition, there's profit in the short run, but because in perfect competition there's free entry and exit, there is no profit in the long run. Okay? So just one more time, right? In monopoly, in the short and the long run, there is profit. In perfect competition, there is profit in the short run, but in the long run, there is no profit. Okay? Why is that? In monopoly, there are barriers to entry. In perfect competition, there are no barriers to entry. There's free entry and exit. Okay? So what is this profit? Where do we see it in here? Okay? This is profit. The difference between the average total cost and the price. Okay? This whole dashed area, let's see if there's another color marker. No more markers. Okay. This dashed area is profit. Why? This is the price the monopolist is receiving. Okay? This is the price the monopolist is charging for every unit of the quantity. Okay? So for every diamond, the monopolist is getting this price. But for this quantity, the monopolist only has to pay this cost. Okay? So the monopolist only has this cost, but they're receiving this price. If your costs are always lower than the price you're charging, you always make profit, right? It means if your price is higher than your costs, then it means the amount of money you receive is always greater than the amount of money you have to pay out. Okay? So that's what we're seeing here. All I did was, we have our equilibrium quantity and our equilibrium price. Now, all I did was I drew a line from our average total cost curve from here over to the y-axis. Okay? Because this is the average total cost per each unit, right? This is our average total cost curve, and this is the units. So for this quantity, this is the average total cost. Which means this and over this box, that box will be profit. Okay? So the monopolist gets to make profit. How much profit? The size of this box. What's the size of this box? P minus ATC, right? If you want to know the size of this box, how do you find the area of a rectangle? It's length times width. Okay? Well, what's this? That is simply this height is simply P minus ATC, which I've written here, times quantity. So it's this times this, which gives you the size of profits that the monopolist will make. Okay? So, that is pure monopoly. Okay? That's all you need to do for monopoly. Remember, there's a few things that are different in here from pure competition. I think I've highlighted those enough during the lecture, okay? But the main difference is that there is no short run, long run for a monopolist, okay? It's the same thing in the short run and in the long run. They're still making profit. Why? Because there are barriers to entry in monopoly, okay? So while perfect competition has profit in the short run, but no profit in the long run, in monopoly, there is profit in the short run and in the long run. Why? In perfect competition, there's free entry and exit, whereas in monopoly, there is barriers to entry, okay? So how do you find your equilibrium quantity? Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's point A. You draw a line down to the equilibrium quantity. Then you go up to your demand curve, and you go over to the price. Okay? So that's how a monopolist figures out how much to produce and what price he or she should charge for it. Okay? And then if you want to know how much profit are you going to make, you simply do the price minus the average total cost, right? You go find your average total cost curve and draw a line over to the y-axis, okay? Now you have a rectangle. Okay? And that will be your total profit. If you want to know how much it is, whether that profit is the short run or the long run, it's a rectangle. The area of a rectangle is length times width, right? Length or height times width, okay? The height is P minus ATC, right? P minus ATC. That will give you this. Then you just multiply it by the quantity, and that will give you the price, okay? So that is monopoly. That's the whole chapter that we're going to go over for monopoly. Next time when we meet, we're going to talk about oligopoly, and specifically we're going to start talking about heterodox economic theory. Okay? Why are we going to start talking about heterodox economic theory? I mentioned it at the end of perfect competition, okay? Because of something called the Cambridge Capital Controversies, which I'll talk about briefly in the next lesson, but because of the Cambridge Capital Controversy, it turns out there's no such thing as a marginal product, which means there's no such thing as a marginal cost curve, which means there's no such thing as a supply curve. And therefore, capitalism does not have a self-adjusting mechanism. Okay? So in other words, if there's no supply curve, it seems that we might need an alternative economic system. We might need an alternative theory of microeconomics in order to describe the real world. Okay? And that's what heterodox economics at least attempts to do. Okay? So that's what we're going to talk about next week in week 6. Okay? I'm going to turn the camera off now, and I'll see you then.